I convinced 500,000 women to end their relationships. I created impossible standards that left an entire generation dying alone. I turned good men into broken shells who accepted they were fundamentally unworthy of love. My name is Sarah, I'm 29 years old, and I wrote a best-selling book that accidentally weaponized feminism against happiness itself. This is the story of how I became a prophet of loneliness, and what happened when I finally opened my eyes to the devastation I'd caused. 3 years ago, I published The Emotional Labor Revolution: How Women Are Done Carrying Men. My thesis was simple and brutal: men are parasites who drain women's energy. Modern women should stop settling for emotional children. Men add nothing to relationships except problems. I'd spent 3 years researching toxic masculinity and male inadequacy. I interviewed hundreds of women about their disappointing relationships, and every single story confirmed exactly what I wanted to believe. Men are selfish, lazy, emotionally stunted. Women do all the work while men coast on bare minimum effort. My book was a manifesto telling women to stop accepting crumbs from mediocre males. And it exploded. The book tour took me across the country. Packed auditoriums every single night. Women cheering when I declared, "You don't need a man to complete you." Standing ovations when I said mediocre men deserve loneliness. I was selling thousands of copies to women who were ready to dump their boyfriends that very night. Publishers immediately wanted a sequel about the great male obsolescence. I felt like I was leading a revolution of female empowerment. Finally, women were learning their worth. Finally, they were refusing to settle. At a signing event in Chicago, a woman approached me with tears streaming down her face. She told me my book had saved her from wasting more time on her worthless boyfriend. She'd dumped him that morning after 4 years together. He'd begged and cried, but she held firm. Now she felt liberated. Empowered. I signed her book feeling like a hero changing the world one relationship at a time. Stories like hers poured in through social media. Women leaving long-term relationships after reading my book. Raising their standards to impossible heights. Refusing to settle for anything less than perfection. I felt like a revolutionary leader, and the validation was intoxicating. Then came the magazine interview. The writer was male, mid-30s, and he seemed nervous interviewing me. He kept asking about my personal relationships, which annoyed me. I smugly told him I was single by choice, that I refused to lower my standards for available men. He asked quietly, "What about men who are genuinely trying?" I laughed in his face. If they were genuinely trying, they'd be worthy. He went silent and scribbled notes with shaking hands. Later, I found out he'd cancelled his own wedding after our interview. His fiancée had read my book and decided he wasn't good enough. 6 years together, and I'd destroyed it with a few paragraphs. Part of me felt victorious. Part of me felt sick. I started noticing a pattern at my book signings. More and more single women showing up. Ages 25 to 40, educated, successful, completely alone. They loved my message, but they seemed increasingly bitter underneath the empowerment rhetoric. When I asked about dating, they'd roll their eyes and complain. All men are trash. I'd rather die alone than settle. Men aren't worth the emotional labor anymore. These women had internalized my message completely. But they didn't seem happy about their choices. One woman, 38 years old, told me she'd been single for 5 years. She'd dumped her fiancé after reading feminist literature like mine. Now she had cats and wine, but she admitted to crying every night. Still, she insisted she'd made the right choice. That being alone was better than being with an adequate man. Another reader, 33, said she'd broken up with her boyfriend of 2 years. He wasn't ambitious enough, didn't read feminist theory. Now she was on dating apps, swiping left on 99% of men. She'd been on 0 dates in 18 months. But she proudly declared she had high standards. Something about these conversations started bothering me, but I pushed the feeling away. When I started researching for my sequel about male obsolescence, I was planning to celebrate how women were choosing themselves over men. But the statistics I found were completely unexpected. Marriage rates were at historic lows. Birth rates were collapsing. And single women were reporting the highest rates of depression and anxiety in recorded history. Dating app data showed women becoming incredibly selective. The average woman swiped right on only 4% of men. Only 4%. But those top 4% weren't interested in relationships at all. They were playing the field with multiple women, creating a system where nobody got what they wanted. I interviewed dating coaches for my research, and they told me about female clients with impossible standards. Women who wanted men who were 6'5", made $200,000, looked like models, but were also feminist, emotionally available, domestic gods who did half the housework. These women were going to die alone waiting for men who simply don't exist. One coach showed me her client list. 200 single women, ages 28 to 45. All successful, attractive, accomplished professionals. All utterly alone because no man met their requirements. Many of them specifically referenced books like mine as the reasoning for their standards. They'd rather have nothing than something they considered beneath them. That's when I decided to interview men for the other side of my research. I was planning to expose their inadequacy and selfishness. I expected to find entitled, angry misogynists who proved all my points. But their stories didn't match my expectations at all. Many of the men I interviewed described years of trying to meet impossible standards, only to be rejected for their height, their income, their social media presence. One guy, a software engineer making $95,000 a year, told me women ghosted him not because he was a bad person, but because he wasn't exciting enough. He showed me his dating profile. Thoughtful, kind, stable. 0 matches in 6 months, despite being objectively decent. He'd given up completely, focusing on hobbies and work instead. Another man was a teacher who volunteered with disabled kids. He said women lost interest the moment they learned his profession. Not prestigious enough, even though it was meaningful work. He was 32 years old and had never had a relationship longer than 2 months. Women always found someone better and moved on. I met a divorced dad, 35, who paid $2,000 monthly in child support. He worked 2 jobs to afford a decent apartment for his custody weekends. Women wouldn't date him because he had baggage. Even though he was a devoted father and hardworking man, he'd accepted he'd probably die alone. These men weren't the monsters I'd expected to find. They were just normal people who'd been deemed inadequate by the standards that my book had helped create and popularize. Many specifically mentioned feminist literature as the reason for their rejection. Women were citing my exact arguments for why these men were unworthy. I started feeling deeply uncomfortable about what I was discovering. These weren't evil patriarchs oppressing women. They were lonely humans who'd been systematically rejected. Many had given up on dating entirely, living quiet lives of resignation and solitude. Then I interviewed a therapist who worked with single men, and everything changed. My clients are increasingly reporting total romantic hopelessness, she told me. They've internalized that they're fundamentally inadequate, that women are right to reject them. Many are considering suicide rather than facing lifelong loneliness. She showed me journal entries from her male clients. Maybe I should just accept I'm not good enough. Women deserve better than what I can offer. I'll just focus on work and die alone. These men had been broken by the standards I'd helped create. They weren't angry. They were just defeated. And I had done this to them. I attended a feminist conference to present my research. There was a panel about the future without men, and the audience of 500 single women cheered about male obsolescence. But when I really looked at their faces, I saw profound sadness in their eyes. They were celebrating loneliness like it was liberation. During the Q&A, a woman stood up crying. She was 42 years old and said she'd followed feminist advice to reject inadequate men her whole life. Now she was childless and alone, watching her friends with families, wondering if maybe her standards had been too high. The audience immediately shouted her down for internalized misogyny. They wouldn't even let her finish her question. Another woman, 36, said she'd dumped a loving boyfriend years ago because he didn't make enough money and didn't have an advanced degree. He'd begged her to reconsider, said he'd do anything. She held firm, convinced she deserved better. Now he was married to someone else with 2 kids. She was still single, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. After the conference, I sat alone in the hotel bar, processing what I'd heard. The bartender was a friendly guy, maybe 30 years old. He asked about my day, and I told him about the conference, expecting him to be impressed. Instead, he looked sad. Yeah, I gave up on dating last year. Women's standards became impossible to meet. He showed me his dating app. 0 matches in 8 months. He said he made decent money as a bartender, but it wasn't enough. Women wanted CEOs and doctors, not service workers. He'd accepted he'd probably never have a family. He seemed strangely at peace with dying alone. I realized this normal, kind man represented millions of others. Good people who'd been deemed unworthy of love because they didn't meet arbitrary standards that books like mine had convinced women to enforce. We'd created a caste system based on superficial metrics, and I was one of the architects. On my flight home, I sat next to a businessman reading a relationship book. He was in his 40s, with a wedding ring tan line but no ring. The book was about winning back your wife. He told me his story without prompting. His wife had left him after 15 years and 2 kids. She said she deserved more, that she'd settled too young. He'd worked 60-hour weeks to provide a comfortable life, but she wanted passion, excitement, constant romance. Now he saw his kids every other weekend and lived in a studio apartment. He wasn't bitter. Just confused. He thought being a good husband and father was enough. But apparently, women needed men to be everything: providers, entertainers, therapists, best friends, romance novel heroes. The standards had become impossible for a normal human to meet. I started seeing this pattern everywhere I looked. The coffee shop barista, 28 years old, told me he'd given up on dating. Women his age wanted men with graduate degrees and 6-figure incomes. He was happy with his simple life, but that wasn't impressive enough. He'd rather stay single than face constant rejection. My Uber driver, 31, divorced after his wife found a better option. She'd left for a man with a bigger house and fancier job. He was still paying alimony while living with roommates. He told me modern women see men as upgradable commodities, like phones. He planned to focus on his kids and forget about romance entirely. The gym trainer at my building, 26 years old, incredibly fit and attractive, but only 5'7". Women dismissed him immediately over height. He had a great personality, stable career, treated women well, but the height requirement eliminated him from consideration before he could even speak. I began questioning everything I'd written in my book. Had I helped create impossible standards? Were women rejecting perfectly good partners because of my influence? Was settling sometimes just accepting reality? Maybe not every relationship needed to be a Disney movie. I reread my book with fresh eyes, and I was horrified. It was basically a manual for becoming impossible to please. Every single chapter raised the standards higher. It told women they deserved perfection, that anything less was betraying themselves. I checked my sales figures. 500,000 copies sold. That was potentially 500,000 women with unrealistic expectations. More than 500,000 relationships ended because partners weren't perfect. More than 500,000 men told they were inadequate human beings. What had I done? My social media mentions poured in daily. Women thanking me for permission to dump their boyfriends. Stories of ended engagements and broken families. But also increasing complaints about loneliness and desperation. The revolution I'd started was making everyone miserable. I interviewed women who'd bought my book 2 years earlier. Many were still single and increasingly desperate. Their standards hadn't dropped, but reality was setting in. They were aging out of their preferred dating pool, but too proud to admit they might have been wrong. One reader, now 35, told me she'd rejected 12 potential partners since reading my book. Each one had failed to meet some requirement I'd outlined. Now she was watching younger women date the men she'd rejected. Those men were married with kids while she was alone. But she still insisted she'd made the right choices. Another woman, 31, had broken up with her fiancé because he wasn't feminist enough. He didn't read enough theory, didn't discuss patriarchy daily. Now she realized she'd prioritized politics over love. He was married to a woman who accepted him as he was. She stalked their social media posts and cried. I started researching what actually makes relationships work long-term. Successful couples cited acceptance, patience, compromise, not the perfectionist standards I'd advocated for. Happy marriages involved two imperfect people choosing each other despite their flaws. My book had taught women to choose nobody. I interviewed relationship researchers and marriage counselors, and they all confirmed the same thing: my book was causing real damage. Women were entering therapy with impossible expectations, refusing to accept normal human flaws in partners, creating a generation of permanently single perfectionists. One therapist showed me her intake forms. An increasing number of women over 30, never married, all citing high standards as the reason for their singleness. When she suggested lowering their standards, they refused. They'd rather die alone than settle for reality. A marriage counselor told me she was seeing the opposite problem too. Men so beaten down by rejection that they'd stopped trying entirely. They'd internalized that they were inadequate. Even when women showed interest, these men assumed it was pity or mockery. Both sides were trapped by standards that nobody could meet. I realized I needed to write a follow-up book admitting I was wrong. That I'd helped break dating culture. That reasonable compromise wasn't betrayal. That good enough was often actually good enough. That dying alone wasn't some victory over the patriarchy, it was just loneliness dressed up in political language. My publisher rejected the new book proposal immediately. They said admitting error would destroy my brand. Their market research showed women wanted validation, not reality. They'd pay for permission to have impossible standards, but not for advice to lower them. The truth didn't sell. But I decided to write it anyway, even without publisher support. I called my new book The Settling Revolution: How I Learned Love Requires Compromise. My core argument was simple: perfect partners don't exist. Rejecting good people over minor flaws leads to loneliness. Standards should be reasonable, not impossible. And most importantly, dying alone isn't victory, it's just sad. The feminist community completely turned on me. I was called a traitor, an internalized misogynist, a pick-me author pandering to men. My speaking events were cancelled. Podcast interviews were pulled. My old allies blocked me on social media. But I couldn't promote loneliness anymore. I couldn't keep selling women a fantasy that was destroying their lives. I self-published the new book despite being blacklisted by the entire industry. Sales were modest compared to my first book, but the reviews were powerful. Women shared stories of finding love after lowering their standards. Men expressed gratitude for acknowledgement of their humanity. Couples were actually reuniting after reading about compromise. One review broke my heart and healed it at the same time. A woman wrote that she'd contacted her ex from 3 years ago. They'd broken up because he wasn't ambitious enough, he was just a teacher who loved his job. Now they were engaged, building a simple but happy life together. She realized love mattered more than an impressive resume. Another reader tracked down a guy she'd ghosted for being 5'8". Turns out, he was an incredible person, just vertically challenged. They'd been dating for 6 months, and she said she'd never been happier. She almost missed her soulmate over 2 inches. My old book would have supported that decision. Would have congratulated her for maintaining her standards. And she would have died alone, convinced she'd made the empowered choice. I started speaking at smaller events about realistic expectations. The crowds were much smaller than before, but the engagement was more genuine. Women were actually admitting they were lonely, asking for permission to compromise. Men were sharing stories of being rejected for unchangeable traits. Everyone seemed desperate for a message of acceptance instead of judgment. I met a couple who credited both of my books with saving their relationship. The woman had initially dumped the man after reading my first book. He wasn't successful or exciting enough. A year later, she read my second book and realized her mistake. They tracked each other down, and now they're married with a baby on the way. She told me, "Your first book taught me I deserved everything. Your second book taught me what I actually needed. I needed a partner, not some perfect stranger from a romance novel." He added, "I'm grateful you came to your senses." After she left, I almost gave up on love entirely. I'd accepted I was fundamentally unworthy. Your second book helped me see that the standards were broken, not me. That's when I understood what redemption actually looks like. It's not just admitting you were wrong. It's working every single day to fix the damage you caused. Every couple that reunites, every standard that becomes reasonable, every person who chooses love over loneliness, that's me slowly undoing the harm of impossible expectations. My new book won't make bestseller lists. It won't get a major publisher or speaking tours at packed auditoriums. But it might save relationships. It might prevent suicides. It might help people find actual happiness instead of perfect misery. And that matters more than literary fame. Looking back, I understand how I got it so wrong. I confused empowerment with isolation. I thought high standards meant impossible standards. I believed that rejecting everyone made you strong, when really it just made you alone. I taught an entire generation of people that good enough wasn't good enough. That minor flaws were deal breakers. That dying alone was somehow better than accepting someone's humanity. If you're single right now because nobody meets your standards, I want you to hear this. Maybe the standards are the problem, not the people. Maybe good enough really is good enough. Maybe love requires accepting flaws. Maybe dying alone isn't a victory. Modern dating is broken because we broke it, with impossible expectations and zero compromise. Men are giving up because they can't win. Women are alone because nobody's perfect enough. Everyone's choosing loneliness over reality. But it's not too late to fix this. Lower your standards to reasonable levels. See potential partners as humans, not projects or resumes. Accept that love requires settling sometimes, and that settling for a real person beats waiting for a fantasy that doesn't exist. Because at the end of your life, nobody wishes they'd died alone. Nobody celebrates rejecting all the imperfect people who might have loved them despite their flaws. We all just want connection, acceptance, belonging. And sometimes that means choosing good over perfect. That's what I'm learning. That's the message I'm fighting to spread now, even if it costs me everything. Because some truths are worth telling, even when nobody wants to hear them.